Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this launch event by foraus, the Swiss think tank on foreign policy. Schengen, Back on the Road, is the title of the publication that we will present to you tonight and that we will discuss with two distinguished guests and all of you in this live stream tonight. In fact, the question of how to reopen Schengen's internal borders in times of COVID-19 is of great importance. In their attempts to slow down the spread of the virus, the national governments have imposed travel restrictions and they have reintroduced controls at their borders. They have done so in an uncoordinated and unilateral way, leading to a situation where every Schengen member state has different rules on who can, how, and why enter their country. And as a consequence, there are not only heavy economic and social costs of these situations, but these measures, together with others on imports and exports, they have led to a lack of trust among states, and they are putting Schengen as a whole at risk. So we think it's very important to step up the coordination efforts among the Schengen states. And we also think it's important to find common solutions to these challenges. And especially this, as the spread of the virus is slowing down, and as our decision makers, for example, tomorrow morning, there's going to be a debate in the National Council on this, are discussing these issues. My name is Lukas Hupfer. I'm the director of foraus and one of the co-authors of this publication that we will present to you now. And I have the honor to moderate this live stream. Together with me are Cécile Rivière and Moritz Fegert, another two of our 6 co-authors, and our 2 distinguished guests, Her Excellency, the Austrian Ambassador to Switzerland, Dr. Ursula Plassnik, and the president of Swissmem, the leading Swiss association of mechanical and electrical engineering industries, Hess. A warm welcome to all of you. Our evening is split into 2 parts. So we will have first a short presentation of the policy brief and its recommendations by Cécile and Moritz. By the way, you can download our publication now on the website foraus.ch. And in the second part of this event, we will discuss this publication together with our guests, starting with 2 inputs by the guests and then a session on different questions and answers. And here I would like to inform you about the opportunity that you can bring up your questions anytime as a comment in this live stream or over Slido, where we have shared the link by you with mail. So I'm very happy to have all of you here tonight in this uncertain time and not so easy situation, but I'm very happy that we have this discussion with you, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about the publication from Moritz and Cécile. Thank you.
Thank you, Lukas. So to start with, I would like to first state what we want to address with our policy brief. It is to address the lack of coordination we have seen amongst Schengen states. And for this, we have 3 recommendations for the states. First, the states should lift travel restrictions and border controls gradually based on common criteria. And this should happen in a timely and safe way. And second, we say that at the same time, this should be supported by accompanying measures. We have seen that in the past, there have been, in the past weeks, there have been different accompanying measures being taken at the border, such as the requirement to show a health certificate, for example, a recent health certificate. But what we say is that states should coordinate themselves and carefully assess these measures according to common criteria and base these on common standards as well, so that you have a unified and mutually recognized response. And finally, we say that the measures taken, the border control measures and travel restrictions taken by Schengen states should be assessed according to their proportionality, and this should happen as part of so-called thematic evaluations, which are part of the Schengen monitoring and a review mechanism. And more generally, the lessons learned in this crisis and also our recommendations should feed into the reforms of the Schengen Borders Code. But so what does it mean in practice? Cécile will now tell you more about it.
Thank you, Moritz. So we've said that we want a transition period to be as coordinated as possible. And in lifting the current travel restriction and border controls, we will have a gradual process. So that's why we identified 4 milestones. Excuse me, I'm just showing you the milestones so it will be more easier for you to understand. 4 milestones, and each of them is defined by the level of control over the epidemic and the level of immunity of the population. Let me explain. So the level of control over the epidemic indicates if states are able to identify new COVID cases, monitor them properly, and if the healthcare systems have enough capacities to address this epidemic without having to shut down all of the categories of care. This level of control can be assessed according to epidemiologic criteria as recommended by the EU Commission and the WHO, for example. The level of immunity of the population indicates which share of the population has been exposed to the SARS-CoV-2 or hopefully in the midterm has been vaccinated. The assessment of this criteria, of course, is evolving. We all know that the scientific knowledge about the virus is gaining weight every day. So governments have to constantly monitor and adapt the measures they are taking according to this knowledge. So let's have a look at the 3rd milestone you see on the graph. Here, we assume that countries have achieved a high level of control over the epidemic, and so we recommend lifting travel restrictions for leisure activities such as tourism and cross-border shopping. Let's take an example. For example, let's assume that Switzerland and the Czech Republic have both reached this high level of control over the epidemic. Their healthcare system has recovered capacities. There is a broad testing policy in both countries. They can identify new cases and each case is monitored. So at this stage, we still assume that some health checks might stay in place at the borders, at the airport, for example, due to the still medium level of immunity of the population. But a family from Locarno shouldn't be prevented from visiting Prague.
Thank you, Cécile. So as part of this roadmap, we also envision the creation of so-called zones of trust, which regions and later on countries can reach as they reach this can create as they reach the same milestone. I'm also going to share a short graphic with you. So here you can see our vision of these zones of trust. Basically, you start at the domestic level and then you create a zone of trust at the regional level. And later on, you can create zones of trust between countries and groups of countries as they reach this same level of control over the epidemic and similar level of immunity and and reach the same milestone. And the idea is that we have a transition period where through a better control over the epidemic and the evolving immunity level, you have bigger and bigger zones of trust, and at the end you have a zone of trust which comprises the whole Schengen area and later on the world. So if we look at the regional level again, this can be highly beneficial for Switzerland, for instance, because in Switzerland you have certain regions which are cross-border regions which are highly integrated with the neighboring regions, such as the Euro district in Basel, or the Lake Constance region, or the Greater Geneva area, or also Ticino and northern Italy. And they could really benefit from these kind of zones of trust and this gradual reopening of travel border controls and lifting of travel restrictions. And so if we take a concrete example, you could take, for instance, the canton of St. Gallen and the federal state of Vorarlberg. if they reach a similar level of control over the epidemic and a similar level of immunity, they could then commonly agree on lifting travel restrictions and border control measures and form a so-called zone of trust. Of course, at which milestone this zone of trust will be established depends on the criteria that Cécile already defined. And as I said, the long-term goal is really to form greater zones of trust and re-establish trust within Schengen and later on worldwide as we gain control over the epidemic.
As you've seen, coordination is really key to ensure a gradual and safe opening of the borders. But we've seen that governments have taken accompanying measures during this epidemic, and these measures need to be carefully assessed. In the paper, if you have a look at it, we defined 8 criteria. But tonight, I don't want to detail the 8 criteria. I'm just showing them to you so that you have an idea how we worked around this framework. But let me insist on 2 of the criteria which are especially important to us. The first one is proportionality, and the second one, which is a word which has been spoken a lot tonight, but we have to insist on it, is trust. So, what do we mean with proportionality? Proportionality means that the restriction to individual liberties shouldn't exceed what is necessary to address the risk or the critical need of the population. And trust in times of crisis is crucial. Citizens need to trust their government to adhere to the measures which are being taken to prevent the spread of the virus. But within the Schengen area, we also need that states trust one another to be able to coordinate fully and exchange information. So let's take a very basic example we have all seen in our respective countries, which is the example of quarantine for suspected or confirmed COVID-19 cases. A recommended quarantine for residents and visitors alike, people with symptoms, seems proportionate in the sense that it's a way to break the transmission of the illness. It reduces risk. And we've seen that population trust these measures. It's a measure which people adhere to because they have the feeling it's the right thing to do and they stick to it. Not all the measures are as easily trustworthy or as easily proportionate. But we strongly believe that impact assessment should be made. We know that it requires resources and it needs to be evidence-based. It's a challenge, we all know that, and the current environment doesn't make it easier with information changing every day. But it is also the responsibility of states to ensure good public policies, even, and I would say, certainly more even in times of crisis.
Thanks, Cécile. And I would like to conclude by restating that what we want to avoid is a further erosion of Schengen and its accomplishments. And if we look at past experiences, we already saw in 2015, 2016, in the context of migratory and pressures and terrorist threats, that states were really quick in reintroducing border controls. But it took much longer, and even maybe it didn't even happen that states then lifted these border controls again. So what we say is that it's really important that at this stage we have a common plan for lifting of travel restrictions and border controls, and that we reestablish and enhance cooperation and we build trust amongst Schengen states. And in the longer term, we say that our recommendations and the practices and what we learned from the current crisis should feed into the current reform discussions of the Schengen Borders Code. These discussions have been ongoing, but were halted and are now on hold. But we say they should restart no longer than before the end of the year, no later than before the end of the year. And finally, last but not least, Switzerland is a highly integrated economy within the heart of Europe. And we believe that therefore it should take a proactive role in these discussions and efforts that we highlighted, recommendations that we highlighted in our policy paper. It should approach its neighbors and initiate discussions around common coordination efforts and standards and joint criteria to reopen borders and lift travel restrictions. And it could really serve as a role model within Schengen to recreate trust and facilitate the coordination of the lifting of border controls in a safe, timely, and gradual way.
Well, thank you very much, Moritz and Cécile, for this presentation. I think we have a clear call to the Swiss government and the other Schengen member states to assess the proportionality of these controls and measures in place, to act together on a roadmap and to assess their accompanying measures at the borders according to clear criteria. So I'm happy to have these different points and your interesting recommendations being discussed later on tonight. But before doing so, I would like to introduce to you Mrs. Plassnik, who will share with us the experience of Austria, or the way how Austria assesses its situation at the borders. Austria, who has been leading the way a bit in exit strategies on the national level, but also on the European level. And I'm very happy that you are here tonight, Mrs. Plassnik. So Mrs. Plassnik, she has been serving the Foreign Ministry of Austria since 1980, thereby working a lot on Europe, be it on bilateral levels or multilateral institutions such as the EU, EFTA, the Council of Europe. She was also the Foreign Minister of Austria between 2004-2008, had several positions in the government and also in the parliament. And now since 2016, she has been here in Bern, where we are having a big thunderstorm right now. So I hope you can still hear us. If not, please signal it to us. And with that, I would really like to give the floor to you, Mrs. Plassnik, on your views and how you see the current situation in Austria, in Europe, and what this means for Schengen. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lukas, for having me, and thank you to Foraus for this timely initiative. I really think it's the right moment. We have to look forward, not only because we like to be forward-looking, but because people demand it. I can see it at the practical point of the embassy, the increase of people calling us every day, asking us, but when are the borders going to be open again? They think we will be back to normal within days. And this leads me to my first point, which is a general point. We have come to really value the free movement, not only of goods, because goods pass freely, but also the free movement of persons. We have realized through the experience of the last weeks that it is not self-evident that we can move inside our own communities, between different communities, and in and out of our own country. We are so used to it. This is never heard, never seen, never experienced. I would never have imagined that the border between Austria and Switzerland would be tight, watertight, and that I would have to study day after day how this is going to change and how we are going to move forward. So on a note of caution, and that corresponds to the content of what you have been researching, we will need time and we will need good procedures and valuable and valid criteria to move out of that situation. We are now from crisis management into risk management, and that requires data, reliable figures, reliable, sustainable, scientific knowledge. As you have already mentioned, the authors have mentioned, this is a bit of a work in progress. but I'm sure we're going to improve that. Now, among neighbors, and this is the specific question I want to contribute to, among between Austria and Switzerland, the cooperation has been very good, and it goes on to be very tight and good. We are aware of the fact that we will have to achieve gradual progress, that there will be different groups of people, there will be evolving criteria, but we have to find a way together. Switzerland has been invited by the European Union to participate in numerous very high-level contacts on crisis management and on the way forward, because it's important for both the European Union and for Switzerland. From what I know, Switzerland has been invited to participate in roughly more than a dozen of meetings on very high level. This is good, because defining criteria is one thing, but it has to be agreed. We have learned from the experience of the lockdown that was made very simultaneously, but in a non-agreed manner. You have pointed to that. Now we have to do better in moving out of this situation. We have to do it together on an ad hoc basis, also, of course, with Switzerland as one of our Schengen partners. And the European Commission has presented a plan, a roadmap on the 15th of April that contains a lot of the criteria, a lot of the steps that will have to be taken. And this paper, presented by the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, contains an explicit mentioning of neighbors. Neighbors should define areas of, and I'm quoting from that paper, travel restrictions should first be eased between identified low-risk areas. Neighboring member states should stay in close contact to facilitate this. This also applies to Switzerland and Austria. In fact, the foreign ministers of Austria, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Germany in a recent video conference have agreed to look for ways of facilitating, of lowering the travel restrictions that we now experience. Now, what is the situation? What is the solution going to look like? Nobody can tell exactly. I do suspect it will be a lot more complex than what you have outlined in your paper. A lot of criteria will have to be taken into consideration. It will, in the end, be a mix of regional elements we already have experienced, for example, with commuters. You have made a reference to Vorarlberg, St. Gallen. I would include parts of southern Germany and, of course, Liechtenstein. So we do have a certain amount of experience in that area of cooperating, of controlling also. We have eased on both sides family contacts. We are working very hard on improving contacts on the economic side of economic operators. This will intensify. Now, it will be a mix of regional proximity and a data-based, figure-based approach, accompanied by safeguards, no doubt about that. I would think that there will be the 3 T's, if you want: testing, tracking, and testing, and tracing. These are the elements that will have to be included in any kind of opening up attempt. We also have to think about it in terms of mobility infrastructure. For the time being, there are no direct train connections or plane connections between, sounds strange, still sounds strange to me, but they do not exist now on a regular basis between Switzerland and Austria. We have worked together very closely, Switzerland and Austria, to repatriate many of our citizens who have been far in countries far away. So there is an expertise in cooperation. We will continue to do this, and it is not possible, this is my concluding remark for this part, it is not possible, unfortunately for now, to define a period of transition in elements of time, in a time dimension. We are, I think, all aware of that. this is what we have to tell our citizens and our Swiss friends calling us at the embassy every day. We will do this in different stages. It will be a gradual process. We hope it will work as fast as possible because data are comparable in the specific region we are talking about. And that should allow us to move ahead, but we have to do this together. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these very interesting and also practical points. The question on time, it already came up from someone who is listening to us. I think we can discuss it maybe later again, also with the authors. What does it mean to have a roadmap? Is it possible to spend my summer holidays in Italy or not? That's one of the urgent questions, but I think we need to acknowledge that we are in a fast changing and difficult environment. Thank you also for your call on cooperation and what you have highlighted regarding the Swiss representation and also cooperation in Brussels and beyond. And I'm happy to hear more from your experience and later on. For doing that, I would like to give the floor to Hans Hess. Hans Hess has been the president of Swissmem since 2010. He is also the vice president of Economy Suisse. And you have been managing different companies, be it as an owner, as a manager, or a member of board of directors. So a very rich experience, and I'm eager to hear and to listen to you how your industries, how yourself perceive the current situation, and with which scenarios do you maybe think and work in the current crisis. Thank you so much for joining us. Hans Hess, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lukas. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like first to also compliment and thank foraus for this initiative. This is addressing an issue which creates huge economic damage to our industry all over Europe. And I would like to particularly look at this border problem from the more economic and industrial perspective. Switzerland, or the Swiss economy, thrives on exports. Our export industry contributes 20% to the Swiss GDP and employs more than 700,000 people in Switzerland and a much larger number even outside of Switzerland. And you know that the larger companies in the machine or in the pharmaceutical industry are often truly international in their organizational setup. So for them, it's maybe easier to deal with this. But the Swiss, typical Swiss small and medium-sized enterprise, the SMEs, they often have a very limited international footprint and they operate mostly out of Switzerland. And on average, they sell 80% of their goods and related services to customers outside of Switzerland. So these companies, some of these companies even sell 100% of their goods outside of Switzerland. On average, the Swiss industry exports 60% of our goods to customers in Europe and a bit more than 50% to customers in the Schengen area. And it's also noteworthy to say that the Swiss industry buys an even slightly larger amount of goods from their suppliers in Europe. So you can see we are, as Ambassador Plassnik has mentioned, we are densely connected. We are highly networked with the neighboring regions around Switzerland, in particular with Baden-Württemberg, with Bavaria, with Austria, with Northern Italy, and with France. And these current travel restrictions have created a big problem for exporters. Their ability to provide maintenance services to their customers is currently very limited by these travel restrictions. And only a small amount of maintenance of machines can be done via the internet. Often service engineers have to go to our customers physically. And if they cannot travel and have these travel restrictions, there is a significant potential damage on their reputation as a reliable supplier and partner for their customers. Some engineers, for instance, need to be able to travel to Switzerland for a final inspection of a machine. So they have to come into our country, but some engineers need to be able to travel from Switzerland to its customers in Europe or elsewhere and have to complete an installation of a machine. And it's maybe noteworthy that before these final installations on either side of the border are completed and all the tests are run, no customer can be invoiced and no cash is coming in. And that's the situation that we're currently in, and that's the situation that creates this economic damage. And this is why the Swiss export industry urgently requests a perspective from our Swiss government on how they envision to open the Swiss borders and how they work with our most important export countries in order to have them do the same. And we urgently need a plan on how to deal with this current uncoordinated matter of closed border. And that's why we are very happy about the initiative that foraus has taken. We very much welcome this effort to lift travel restrictions in a coordinated manner with Europe and beyond, in a reasonably fast but controlled and sustainable way. And that would be probably at this point in time the most important improvement for the situation of the Swiss industry. And I'm also sure it will be the same thing for our European colleagues. Specialists, technicians, other key people, as well as customers from Europe and beyond shall be allowed to enter Switzerland as soon as possible. There shall be no sectorial restriction. You know, we have heard about the concept of so-called essential businesses, but this concept has proven to be an inadequate restriction because you see, even respiration equipment that was so urgently and badly needed in hospitals, they all also have a lot of parts, and some of these parts and components are supplied by, so to speak, non-essential businesses, parts like screws or parts like sealings. So lifting travel restrictions within the Schengen is a very positive first step, but it is not sufficient for the Swissmem industries. Other top non-Schengen export countries for the Swiss industry are, for instance, also the United States with 14% of its exports, or China with 6%, or UK with 6%, or many other countries. So this means that opening border, in our view, does not only concern opening roads, but it also concerns opening airports and opening air traffic. We agree that international travelers need to take specific protective measures to reduce the exposure and also the expansion or a second wave of this coronavirus. And we share the concern that open borders should increase the spread, should obviously not increase the spread of the coronavirus. But therefore, entry should be conditional to specific protective measures on an international basis, agreed amongst the countries, and that will be important. As requested by foraus, opening the borders for Schengen area and beyond in a coordinated manner, therefore, I would say, will give the Swiss exporters and their friends and customers around Europe this badly needed perspective on how to recover from the current crisis with a hopefully limited damage, but the damage already now is very significant. So back to you, Lukas.
Thank you so much. And thank you also for sharing these very concrete examples, because I think many people, they don't realize what we need in order to produce something in Switzerland or to do services here in Switzerland or abroad. And I think it's very important to be aware of the consequences of these travel restrictions and also border controls, be it on the economic level or also social level. We have touched upon a bit two dimensions if we take geography into account. On the one hand, this regional approach proposed by the European Commission and also in our paper by these zones of trust. So to reopen first areas, border areas that have a similar level of control and immunity, as we have called it. And then we also have the level mentioned by Mr. Hess beyond Schengen. So Schengen non-member states, be it in Europe or be it in the United States, China, Asia, Africa. And I would like to go a little bit into these two questions, maybe first with Ms. Plassnik. You mentioned there is also experience at the border between Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Germany, Austria, on how to track and trace people that would start to move there. Could you maybe develop a little bit what would be possible in slides, and then also Moritz and Cécile, if you would like to complement anything on the zones of trust concept presented in the paper, please feel free to start a discussion.
Well, thank you. I first wanted to add something to what Mr. Hess said, because I think it's in practical life important, and that is the element of reciprocity, that you really try in a neighboring area to agree on, if I can soften up on this, why can't you follow? What do I mean in practical terms? Exactly the problem that Mr. Hess was alluding to. Service engineers, they can now go into Austria. Swiss service engineers can go into Austria without any problem if they can provide an information about what they want to do and how long this is going to last. So why can't we do this reciprocally? Why can't the Swiss agree on their side that this would be, you know, a very tiny opening, but it would be an important signal to encourage those who have worked so hard for economic contact, for being each other's customers, each other's service providers. That would do no harm to anybody on the epidemiological level. It would not have any kind of migratory risk that could be imagined, nothing. It's just disruptive and nothing more to our economic interaction. That was the first remark I wanted to make. Now, what is the experience in that very closely integrated area around the Bodensee? Let's call it that way also. The experience is that during the first closing down of borders, you had to take measures that had to be foolproof in a way, that were not very sophisticated, and they are still in line. If I, as an Austrian ambassador living in Bern, want to go to Vienna to see my boss, I will have to go into 2 weeks of quarantine, self-confinement, 2 weeks. Now, is this appropriate in the next step? What could replace such a possibility? Switzerland, by the way, has never had this compulsory self-confinement topic. It was a recommendation for people coming back from abroad, but it was not compulsory. Now, I'm thinking ahead of my own government, which is a possible thing to do in a think tank situation. One day we will have, and I hope it's going to be sooner rather than later, we will have to replace the model of 2 weeks of self-confinement for every Austrian entering Austria and for everybody else by a more sophisticated way of control. And this is why we have discussed or mentioned what could it look like. Now, we have increased our test capacity. We have learned a lot and rapidly during the crisis, all of us. We have increased our capacity for testing. We are developing new types of tests. There will be serological tests available soon, if I understand, that might help as well. We do have ample testing now to prove that you are negative. And that is already the first sort of softening down on the Austrian side. If you can provide a negative certificate that you're corona-free, then you don't have to go into the quarantine. Now, the next issue that comes to our mind is, of course, these tracking possibilities, the apps. The Austrians and the Swiss absolutely share one point. They want this to happen on a voluntary basis. Both of our countries are very eager and sensitive on data protection. So this is, it takes time. We are working hard. Austrians have already developed a tracking app. Switzerland will follow as of next Monday. So there are possibilities. If we can establish equivalence on such issues, it might be helpful. Because there is one thing, we are regaining control over the pandemic, over the virus, but this means we have to keep this control. And we will only have it if we do more effort in the testing, on the testing side, on the tracking and tracing side. and combine these measures to gradually lift the restrictions. A zone of trust, I have the impression that this is what is in place because commuters can move freely, family members can meet again. We have exceptions for humanitarian issues and cases of urgent need. So that helped to establish a good practice that we will be able to build on.
Thank you so much. I have a lot of questions to you, but I would first give Hans Hess quickly the possibility to respond to your comment that you made on his presentations. I don't know if on this reciprocal comment. I don't know, Mr. Hess, how you see it.
Yes, I completely agree with Ambassador Plassnik. I think, you know, the Austria and, for instance, Germany and Switzerland are very close with regards to the development of this epidemic situation. And to be very honest and also a bit critical to my own government and maybe also the other governments, because I've not been part of these negotiations, but I am surprised why we have not been able to find a solution to actually release this border control or open the borders and allow these business people to travel again. Only these three countries, Switzerland, Germany, and Austria.
Liechtenstein, please.
And Liechtenstein, please.
Liechtenstein.
And Liechtenstein, yes, absolutely. This would be already 30% of our export, which would be reopening in a certain sense. So I think this is truly important that we find a solution. And I agree that, you know, it's not only about opening the borders, but we have to find these protective measures. We have to define those protective measures. And even if it's a bit complicated, you know, if I have to fly, if I have to go through an airport, I'm happy that maybe I have to demonstrate a less than 2 days old COVID test result. So I can do that. I have to wear masks during the flight, and in the airports, I have to do fever control and all kinds of things. I don't mind. We don't mind doing that. And we don't mind when we agree, all of us agree on what is necessary, but we have to be able to find a coordinated way of dealing with this, and that's what's lacking at this point in you. And a lot of, you know, the scientific people also don't necessarily help. If we cannot wait until they have finished their scientific debate on what is the ultimately best. The damage that is created to the economy, the damage that is created to the society also, the damage that is created to these governments by this tremendous collapse of the economy. This has to be balanced better. I think I recommend to our government that they have to better balance the medical aspect together with the economic aspect and the social aspect. And they have to find a better way. We have been driven by the also by the academics, but by the medical aspects mainly. And I think it's time to change and time to find solutions in a coordinated manner to actually reopen.
Thank you. These are very clear words, and I think the key word of accompanying measures, it's also something that we have looked into deeply in our publication, because in the best case, of course, states would align these measures. So in order to travel within Europe or others, you would have the same measures at each airport or border. And there we are a bit skeptical that the states will finally agree on common measures, but at least they have to coordinate each other's.
But even if even if I go to Germany and I have to wear a mask, and if I go to Austria and I don't have to wear a mask, I can adapt to this. You know, yeah. We're all willing to recognize that the individual countries have some sovereignty, and they have their own views and their own situations, but they should tell us what they want, and we will do it. But we want to travel.
And as you also mentioned, there are different interests or also values or to balance, and it's a word of complexity. So we have to deal with what we have, and because this is kind of the basis, and because there are many also ethical and other questions linked to the measures, we in our paper have these 8 criteria that we would like to assess them with. So maybe Cécile, you presented 2 of them, but maybe you could develop just a little bit more about the thoughts and ideas behind it.
Yes, we spent a lot of time while writing the paper also into framing the kind of dilemmas government are facing, because as you rightly said, Mr. Hess, there is a balance to find between economic, social, health. You have many dimensions in this context, and so we devoted a full chapter of our paper with the title "It's Policy Making in the Dark," because at some point it was really what it was. There was this huge tide coming to governments, and with tiny little boats to fight against it. You can't fight a tide coming to you. And so government had to adapt very quickly. And up to some point they did. And they did pretty well, I would say, even. The question now, and here I think we all fully agree, is to find new criteria to try to unlock it. And of course, it's always easier to lock everything than to delock it. So we had this, we defined 8 criteria, and it was also important for us that these criteria would also be criteria which are also used in other public policy contexts. So one criteria which seems to be obvious, but we had to state the obvious also in this paper, was the first one, is the geographical scopes of the measures and the duration, because it's also something which some segment of the society fears, is that if we put stringent measures, or if we start to have stringent measures, they will last after the crisis is over, after the epidemic is controlled. And this is a very important criteria for the citizens and for the economy. So, for example, this is one of the criteria we define. Mrs. Plassnik said Austria and Switzerland are deeply attached to privacy and data protection. That's also something very important, especially in a digitalized and highly digitalized society as Switzerland and Austria are. And these are also components of trusts. The app Mrs. Plassnik was talking about, it will only work, or it will only help to make informed decision if people use it. And people will only use it if they have the feeling this app is not a policy tool, but this app is really to help them monitor the epidemic. And so that's all this range of criteria we define, we think very valid. But again, it's such a fast changing environment. We thought that it would, as a think tank, our value added was rather on defining and identifying these coordination criteria rather than make an assessment of each very specific measures, because with the progress of the science and also with the coordination, the states are hopefully starting, then some of them will outdate extremely quickly.
You know, if I may add a comment to this or an observation, I think these criteria are good criteria, and I welcome the effort that you have made to put them forward. But I would also kind of recommend that you do not expect that this can be automatically applied. You know, this is a dialogue between countries, and it's based, and you said that trust is the key value thing. You know, they have to find their own ways to finally trust each other and let people flow. And I think so. So I think it cannot be kind of a, okay, here is the criteria, here is the levels of those criteria, therefore automatically things open. But I think it's a great framework to try to think about what criteria are actually really important.
And I just wanted to add on that Mrs. Plassnik also mentioned that the guidelines of the EU Commission was published mid-April, and we've seen that we had already started to think about our criteria, and of course these criteria overlap, most of them, with what the EU Commission also says, because at some point it's good public policy criteria.
Well, if I could join the debate here on two questions, tourism, number two, and immunology to start with, because this is one of the issues you mentioned in your paper. And this is where I have my doubts, to be very honest with you. And I think that the importance of think tanks and policy papers is also to sort of make you understand better what will work less well in reality and what might work better in reality. So the level of immunization of our respective countries will be very hard to determine in a useful period of time, to be honest, for practical purposes. So I would much rather go forward with initiatives like you have it now at the airport of Vienna, because Mr. Hess mentioned the airports. I had the same attitude, you know, tell me what to do and I will comply. If I get a test now, I can test in Vienna airport. I have a COVID test possibility with a quick result. This might be very helpful, not only in Austria for incoming people, but also if I go to different other countries where this might be requested. Rules change, they are in constant flux. And there are some things that you will be able to rely upon in the future. Of course, that means also that we recognize each other's procedures in order to have a test, a result, a viable result of a test. Now on tourism, because the question was brought up earlier, and because I think that as important as it is, Mr. Hess, to think about the machine industry, but both our countries, Austria and Switzerland, have a good part of their national economies and wealth creation also in tourism. We are tourist countries, and it is very strange to see the center of Vienna or the center of Bern or Lucerne empty of tourists. It's a new experience. Same thing as looking at Paris or at Moscow, completely void of people. So this is again a situation we have not expected and we will have to cope with. For Austria, Swiss tourists are the number 3 in our Übernachtungen. I don't know what the word is in English, but the nights spent as tourists in Austria, there are about 5 million last year. That's a lot. That's number 3 in our tourist ranking. So of course we are very interested to get Swiss tourists back, as Switzerland will be very interested. There are huge problems in the tourism sector. People do literally not know, and most of them are small and medium-sized enterprises, family business. They have absolutely no idea. It's heartbreaking to see whether they will be able to survive or not. And they do need a perspective. So we will have to think about that also urgently. Of course, that will take us out of the regional context, because there's only a certain amount of tourism that will be done between St. Gallen and Vorarlberg and Liechtenstein and southern Germany. So this will make us think in terms of criteria we will have to establish and methods we have to find to manage, all while keeping the handbrake in our hands. We will have to monitor the process, and we will have to not only establish criteria, but we will also have to find monitoring possibilities in order to step on the brake or to pull the handbrake if things start getting into the wrong direction, because there is no opposition between health and the economy. These are two sides of the same human existence experience. We need both.
Yes, and if I just can add, I mean, you know, we have to have a new set of protective measures, which allows us under all circumstances to shut down again. We have to learn how to deal with pandemic situations without having to shut down our economies. This is so expensive. This is creating so much damage to us and our children and our grandchildren that we have to learn this. So I think this is an important element. And, you know, tourism, if we open Switzerland, Germany, Austria, and Liechtenstein, the biggest tourism stream comes to Switzerland, comes from Germany. So I mean, we can help also tourism. It's not only the industrial business or any other businesses, also tourism. And but I think we also have to be realistic. You know, it's also a matter of trust for the tourists. Do they actually want to come? If they can come, I'm not so sure. You know, we have to it's probably easier for people, or people will trust more to stay within their own countries rather than traveling abroad, if we cannot establish this certain level of trust that you have mentioned also in your study in foraus.
Thank you. Before going into the last part of our discussion, I would just like to quickly give the floor to Moritz. You have mentioned the level of immunity, a criteria that we have presented and also discussed at length. So maybe Moritz, you could develop just in 2-3 words on what was our reasoning behind this additional criteria.
Sure, thanks. Thank you, Lukas. So, I mean, what we basically say is that you cannot ignore immunity. Immunity is an important factor within this whole problematic, but it's not the only one. So this is why we included immunity as part of our criteria, but we also look at epidemiologic criteria, healthcare system capacity, and also at the monitoring capacity that countries and healthcare system have. So it should never be seen as the only criteria, but really as a part of our criteria that states should assess, and it would be it's important to have it as part of this toolbox that we present basically. But of course, and one reasoning behind also having immunity level is that it enables you to assess certain measures. I mean, there's a lot of different measures which also where you need to consider the immunity to look at their effectiveness, etc. And this is why we have this criteria as well. But we are aware that there are still certain scientific uncertainties, and that they should also be addressed regarding the length of immunity, etc.
It was also a bit in the context of the discussion. Okay, we talk about lifting travel restrictions, but we also talk about lifting controls at the borders. So even if you could move freely again, and you would still have controls, and certain parties would like to keep them as long as possible, they also come with costs, be it on freedom or be it on economic costs. And so this leads us a bit to the final part that I would like to take up, and that is also based on questions that came in from the public. Again, like the cooperation among states in that crisis, the nationalistic approaches versus the slow, but now the slow move by multilateral institutions. Somebody mentioned EU and the UN, these entities, they show the supranational entities that multilateralism doesn't work in times of crisis. States, they return back to their measures, to their national borders and so on. So linked with that, and I would like to start with Mrs. Plassnik, maybe, how do you see this challenge of states cooperating in crisis also, and with regard to Schengen? I mean, what is actually at stake if these border controls stay in place for many, many months? Where do you see difficulties, challenges, but maybe also some lights towards closer coordination again?
Well, the first remark I would like to make is that the Schengen Agreement includes the possibility that you can pull the brake, an emergency brake, as a country concerned. So this is not what's happening now, is not what we like to see, but it was absolutely necessary. This is a trigger, an alert emergency brake triggered by a number of countries. I was amazed as an old hand diplomat that this all happened as if it was a silent orchestrated thing within 2 or 3 days, you know, practically all across Europe. I would never have believed that. If we try to organize something in global governance or in European governance, it takes some time. But this went as if it had been all agreed in advance. So, and it was foreseen. Schengen offers exactly this kind of flexibility that we need. It was not so much the national dimension that counted in my analysis, but more on the very immediate local, regional level, because we were confined. Don't forget, we were confined to our houses. We were only allowed to leave for specific purposes. So this had nothing to do even with, being nationalistic or whatever. It was the way to shut down our movements and to separate people. This was the objective, and this continues to be the objective. So we have to do it gradually, and we have to do it cautiously. I think that now we have been aware of the fact that the multilateral approach is the reasonable and rational thing to do. But it took the European Union and other partners, think about the WHO, it takes a while until you can come forward with specific measures. Now, I wanted to also mention one point. The European Union has an agency that sits in Sweden, and it's called the European Center for Disease Control. Switzerland, in January, before the crisis really erupted, applied to be integrated or be admitted to the early warning system that this European Center for Disease Control has established. I think that is an important element because it shows, and the experience of the last weeks proves, that we need more data, we need more information, we need to be on safer ground to argue in a rational way with our citizens and with our politicians why we do this, why we do that, why this is necessary. We are balancing extremely delicate values in this whole process, and Mr. Hess has referred to them. We are taking dramatic measures with regard to the economy. There is rising poverty, there is unemployment. We haven't talked about unemployment. We have not talked about Kurzarbeit, which is in English, help me now, with the Kurzarbeit.
Short working hours.
Okay, short working hours. I mean, all these things are interesting measures. We're all taking them, but they will cost the taxpayer. They will cost a lot of money to all of us. And we do not want, we try to avoid everything to disrupt the economy, the employment situation, and go into a deep recession. This is what we want to avoid. So this is why the neighborhood is important, and why multilateral cooperation, if it's only 4 countries cooperating, take Austria, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Germany, I mean, this is multilateral already. So we know for sure that this is the way out, and that we have to coordinate now and to find a way forward among ourselves in smaller groups, in trust, the high trust level areas, but we can do it. We should also trust the fact that we can manage to get out of this.
But if I allow myself to challenge you just a little bit on the Schengen, I mean, you're right in saying that what happened was legally 100% correct. Every country notified the European Commission. They said we're going to temporarily introduce these border controls. But we also have seen in the migration crisis that some of these internal border controls in Denmark or Germany or France, they have been now in place for 4 years. And I mean, reform discussions have been going on between the Commission, Parliament, Member States, but without a result right now. So isn't there a risk that these now COVID-19 related border controls actually also stay in place for many years, and Schengen kind of becomes dysfunctional in the sense that these on the level of internal border controls?
Not at all. I see it in a totally different way. And I've said, I think at the outset, why? Because there will be such pressure from our citizens. They have developed the trust and the need to be able to move. This was imposed from the outside on all of us. We all had to deal with this, and we are all gradually moving out of it. Nobody has contested in the European Union or even with our Schengen partners that this is a useless system, and we are going to cancel it, and we are going to withdraw into our national snail house, Schneckenhaus, if you want. This has proved to be impossible. This is what I said at the outside. We are recognizing the value that was so self-evident for everybody. We can move across borders. now that we haven't had the possibility for a couple of weeks, we're already thinking that, this is an impossible state of affairs. So I think there's going to be a lot of popular pressure, but it will be on a note of caution. It will take time. It will come in cleverly calibrated steps. Schengen is not dead at all, but what happened really proved that there is a necessity to go ahead hand in hand and to make the Schengen freedoms fully operate again. Also, don't forget the other side of Schengen. Schengen, of course, has also the side of being able to cooperate very closely on issues like crime prevention or combating crime and other issues. So there are a lot of sides to Schengen.
Thank you very much. That was a question from Christoph Wicki also. And I think, Mr. Hess, you were just about to react before.
I think for me, the biggest learnings at this point in time are that we can identify and set up two things that allow us hopefully never to have to close these borders again in such a way. One is an early warning system. We have to earlier find out that something is happening in order to then implement a certain level of accompanying measures. I think, actually, to be very honest, and I look forward to that piece of research, but in Switzerland, the ETH Zurich actually thinks that already the cleaning of the hands and not shaking hands and things like that have already helped quite significantly. Would it have been enough? I don't know, but we will have to find out. Or maybe it would have been much more sensible to ask everybody to wear masks, even though this is not a complete protection, but it's again another level of protection, because the damage that comes from this border closing and the damage from having to shut down people and shut down businesses and keep people at home is so bad that I think this is the ultimate. So we will have to find other ways on how to react on such pandemic crises. And this is, for me, the biggest learning. So we can, in future, avoid having to shut down borders, having to shut down businesses, having to keep people in the home. The damage is too big.
I think that was already kind of a very nice final statement. Don't worry, you get the floor again. But I think the notion of learning, the notion of growing in this period now, not crisis management, but risk management that has been promoted, I think that's very important, because we will continue living in this situation with a lot of uncertainty and complexity. So we need to adapt. We need to kind of find smart solutions in order to avoid these drastic measures that we had in the beginning of the crisis. So I'm just looking at the questions again by the public. I think we have treated most of them. Maybe one that came in from Nadeida was about traveling beyond the Schengen area, so not only intra-Schengen. And I would kind of like to take this question as a final question. You don't have to respond, all of you, directly to it, but let's have a final round. Maybe this traveling notion gives you some dreams, some hopes, some scenarios for the future that you would like to share for the upcoming months. But please feel free to share your final thoughts and maybe also wishes and hopes in this rather difficult time that we are living in. So who would like to start? Cécile, I'm picking you, so.
Thank you, Lukas. My hope, which is also something Mrs. Plassnik challenged a bit, and I think it was also a discussion, a question from the public. As we said, we have 4 milestones. And we know it's not a teleological process. We know that it might not be linear. Of course, I think we all wish to already be on the 4th milestone. Maybe there are a few milestones we can skip. That would be great. That would be my hope. But again, it's better to go, as our health minister put it very nicely, as slowly as necessary, as fast as possible. So that's my hope, that at some point we might skip some steps, but still with the aim, with a clear goal in the head that we're not lock down the country once again in a few months.
Thank you. Moritz?
Yeah, I mean, I can just echo what Cécile said. I would really also look forward for reopening and the possibility to travel again. But as we said, it should be safe and timely, and really, we do not want to go too quickly, but also not too slowly. So I hope that we provided a good framework for states that to enable this gradual opening and safe opening. Yeah.
And you know, just to second this, I mean, the better we understand the effect of accompanying measures, and this needs still scientific research, we are not completely there, but the more we understand, the faster we can actually open the borders again. We will not be able to open borders without accompanying measures, and people will not trust each other without accompanying measure. So I think the importance of accompanying measures is really truly important, short term, mid-term, and also long term. My biggest hope and dream and wish from this crisis is that we learn from it. We will probably not be in a situation to not have pandemics again in the world. This is maybe something that we have to live with. But my dream and my hope is that we can learn from this crisis how to manage it so much better that the damage that we created this time for so many people around the world, and we have talked about Europe, go into India, go into other places. It's a total social disaster, and we have to find a way and learn how to avoid this going forward.
Thank you so much.
Well, maybe I can join in. One of the things that gives me hope is scientific cooperation. From what I hear from the scientific community, this crisis is an accelerator of scientific cooperation. I would have wished this could go even much further than it does right now, because now everybody is developing their own apps, everybody is developing their own vaccines, everybody is developing, there is competition, of course. We will be all benefiting from a certain amount of competition, but I wish that related to pandemics, we would develop greater European and global capacity to combat and counteract. To find smart solutions, that would be my personal wish. I can see a certain amount of asynchronicity from what we are allowed to do inside and what we can do between countries. So I think it is urgent and necessary that we develop a best practice model. A small example, and I do very much believe, if I look at Europe, that the region around the Bodensee, or the region with Vorarlberg, maybe Tyrol, Liechtenstein, parts of Germany and parts of Switzerland, could constitute such a model, could constitute such a building block that would serve on the European level as an encouragement to everybody. We have the same level of, from the case numbers, we have the same kind of figures, we have the same, very similar data. We could develop here quite rapidly a solution, a regional solution that could serve as an example for others. That would be my very practical housewife-ish wish, if I may say so.
Well, thank you very much for this wish, and also this call to act together regionally, across borders, but also not to forget about the rest of the world. There are many challenges out there, many interesting questions that we were not able to discuss tonight, but that are relevant. And we, at least from our side, foraus, we would be happy to continue this discussion with you, Mr. Hess, Ms. Plassnik, but of course also with the public out there in the live stream and the decision makers here in Switzerland that will debate these questions tomorrow, a first time. And in order actually to continue discussion, we have been setting up a digital platform for us. It's called policykitchen.com, as a policy and kitchen. So we cook new ideas And there is a discussion group on COVID-19, on multilateralism, on these border questions, on many other impacts by the crisis, and we invite you to follow and to contribute there. And with this, I would really like to thank you, the participants of this panel tonight. For me, it was very interesting to discuss with you, and I hope also for those listening to us in the live stream that it was a good experience. Go and read the publication on the website, come back with your comments. We are really interested in your feedback. And thank you so much, Hans Hess, for joining us tonight. Thank you so much, Mrs. Plassnik. And also thank you to my co-authors. So we had Cécile Rivière and Moritz Fegert tonight here discussing, but we also had 3 other co-authors where we have been working day and night the last month. And these are Marta Calcina. She's actually from Andorra. She joined us always from Andorra, which is not a Schengen member state, we've learned. We also had Julie Contalou with us, the Vice President of Foraus, and we had Nicoline Detrecoy, who's a Foraus member. And thank you so much to this great team. I think we have worked hard and a nice product out there. And with this, thank you so much. Have a nice evening, and keep to stay engaged with us on Policy Kitchen and other channels. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.